Hi, I'm Amanda Morgan, and this is Not Just Cute, the podcast, where we discuss all kinds of topics relating to intentional whole child development and supporting the critical work of parents and teachers of young children. Before we get started, I wanted to mention the affiliate sponsor for today's show, the Parenting Super Bundle. This collection of resources touches on a huge variety of topics to help you find your parenting groove this fall. From behavior and special needs to planners and organizers, and even recipes, arts, activities, and preschool curricula, this bundle is chock full of value. It also includes my own ebook, Parenting with Positive Guidance. So if you've been thinking about picking that up, you've almost paid for the entire bundle already. There's a total of 80 resources, including ebooks, e-courses, and printables. Separately, these tools would cost well over $1,000. But for the next 6 days, you can get them all for less than $30. That's ridiculous savings right there. The bundle is on sale for a limited time, so be sure to check out the Parenting Super Bundle affiliate link in this episode's show notes. I know for me, fall is the perfect time for a parenting reboot. Reorganize, refocus, and recharge. Get the tools to help you do that with the Parenting Super Bundle. Check it out in today's show notes. Today, I'm taking on a couple of common questions about early education and reading. The questions seem to be opposites, but are really two sides of the same coin. In one form, I hear, why don't you teach reading? The other is, isn't it damaging to teach kids reading in preschool? Both questions are well-intended, but they hinge on some common misunderstandings I hope to address today. You can find the show notes for today's show at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 13. So now, let's jump in. So there are two common questions that I've heard both as a teacher and from readers at Not Just Cute. One is, why don't you teach reading in preschool? Why are you not teaching reading? Which any teacher in a preschool classroom would probably either laugh or cringe at that question. The other question, which is similar to me, though it sounds very different, is, isn't it damaging to teach reading too early? Won't we mess up our kids if we teach preschool or teach reading in preschool? Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, it sounds like these are opposite questions, but I really feel like they're based on the same misunderstandings. And so that's what I want to talk about today. So let's first talk about the state of reading in early education today. Now, I've mentioned many other places that there was a study called Is Kindergarten the New First Grade that was done recently, where they looked at input from teachers in 1996, I believe, and compared that to teacher responses in 2010. So this was all existing data, and they were just comparing to see how those perceptions and practices had changed over that period of time. So there were a lot of things that had changed over that time, a lot of things that researchers were talking about, but one that got a lot of people talking was the fact that one of the questions asked, is kindergarten the right time for kids to start reading? And in 1996, there were 30% of teachers who responded saying, yes, kindergarten is the time when kids should begin reading. And in 2010, that number jumped to 80%. So that was a huge jump in our perception about kids and reading in the early childhood years. Now that can be reflected, that could be reflecting a lot of different issues. It could be reflecting our perception of what it means to be reading. It could be a change in our reflection of what we expect of our kids, which is one of the bigger concerns. Are we expecting things from our kids before they're developmentally ready? But there are a lot of things that can play into that. But I think one thing that we definitely get from that is that there is a change, a shift in our expectations about young children and reading, where in the past, we didn't really see it as a task of kindergarten or preschool. We saw it more of a first, second grade task. And now we are hearing more and more about kids being expected to meet benchmarks in kindergarten that used to be first grade benchmarks. And that's a source of concern for a lot of reasons. So that's why you get some people saying, I've heard that you shouldn't teach reading in preschool because it's going to burn them out or stunt them or mess something up, right? So you also hear from parents in particular when they say, why don't you teach reading in preschool? Because they're concerned because they know about these higher expectations and benchmarks for early literacy, right? So they know that there are some expectations for their kids to be reading perhaps in kindergarten, and they want to make sure that you're teaching it in preschool. And when they come look in your classroom, they don't see anything that looks like worksheets and flashcards. They become concerned that maybe you're not teaching reading. So as I mentioned before, I think these two questions, these two perceptions are really based on some of the same misunderstandings. And so that's what I want to tackle here. First of all is how we define reading. I actually don't use the term reading very often when I'm talking about early education. And here's why. When we say reading, our kids reading, let's make sure your kids can read. We tend to, as a public, as a society, we tend to picture this task of reading, a performance, the act of sitting down and reading a book, right? And in reality, that task really can reflect a wide spectrum of abilities, right? Because you can be reading in preschool, the type of book that you're reading is very different from the book that you're reading in high school. And those reflect a big shift, a big difference in your reading abilities and the different skills that you've acquired to allow you to read Dr. Seuss versus Tolstoy, right? So your comprehension skills, your decoding skills, all of these reading skills are different. And so it's really difficult for me to talk about reading as one monolithic event that happens. And I think that's one of the first problems that we have as a society. We talk about reading kind of in that way. Our kids reading fluently, that's really a sliding scale depending on where the kids are in their developmental levels and in their reading levels. What I prefer to talk about is literacy. I think of literacy as more of that collection of skills. So when somebody talks about, are you teaching reading in preschool? While I think it could be argued that you definitely are, I refer to it as literacy, that we do early literacy, we work on literacy skills or pre-reading or early foundational literacy skills. And to me, again, that difference is a shift in perspective of looking at reading as a performance task to literacy, which is a collection of skills that will continue to build one on another and allow them to do that task of reading. And so particularly in early education, I feel like the important emphasis and focus should be on those literacy skills that will apply in a variety of levels. So wherever kids are, they still need to build all of those different literacy skills. And we'll talk about what some of those are in just a minute. But I first just want to emphasize that importance of perspective of looking at those foundational skills. I've talked before about the metaphor about building a home, right? So when you build a house, I know for me, we did this just a few years ago, and I was so anxious to just get that house built and to get moved in. I was tired of living out of boxes and just living in squalor. I wanted to get that house done and get moved in and get established. I wish I could say that now we are totally established and not living in squalor, but that remains to be seen. But that's a talk for another day. So in my anxiety, my anxiousness to get established, get a house built, I was not so anxious that I would skip over the process of building a foundation, right? Anyone who builds a home knows that first you have to build that foundation, and that process is pretty intensive and time consuming and resource consuming. It's this long process of digging and setting the forms and filling and reinforcing and sealing, and it gets inspected all along the way because it's critical, this foundation, to the rest of the house. Those straight square walls depend on a straight square foundation. And the safety and security and stability of that house depends on the quality of the foundation and the stability that it creates to hold the house. I mean, they don't just set a house on top of the foundation. There are rods and straps that really secure it to it. It really depends on that foundation. But at the same time, when we go looking at homes, say when you're shopping for a new home or going to a home show, people rarely get caught up at looking at the foundation. You aren't driving down the street and say, "Ooh, honey, slam on the brakes. Check out that foundation. I love this house. We have to have it because I love that foundation," right? We don't tend to save pictures of foundations in our Pinterest file for our dream house. It's just something we tend to skip over, and we don't see it unless we have a trained eye for it. And it's similar in early education. We tend to think of reading as that skill, the house, right? The performance that we can see. Everybody is interested in getting to that reading performance. And in that process, sometimes we have people who have not been trained to see the importance of the foundation or to recognize what those activities look like in the foundation that will allow a child to truly read. If we just focus on trying to get a performance out of them, that's like just trying to focus on building a house. We've skipped over the foundation, and though we may be able to get that performance, we might be able to slap a house together, it's not going to be stable, it's not going to be strong, and it's not going to be lasting. We have kids who struggle because they don't have those foundational skills. So we have to start with the foundational skills. We have to help parents and teachers to recognize what those foundational skills look like, because sometimes people will walk into a classroom and what they see as playing, they don't understand is part of that foundational literacy building. So if they walk into a classroom and they see nursery rhymes and finger plays and songs, they may not recognize we're building phonemic awareness. If they see kids playing in the dramatic play area and they think it's just dress up, right? It's just play. When in reality, they're building some strong language skills. They're understanding the structure of story and narration, the structure of that and how it works. And they're also working with representative or symbolic play, which is part of the process of recognizing letters are symbolic for sounds and words and stories, just like the objects they use for symbolic play. So it goes on and on. So many activities that they do in the classroom that may not be recognized for what it is. It's building that foundation that might be missed, that might not be recognized or appreciated unless it's not there. So we need to help parents and teachers to recognize that. I brought up this topic for discussion on my Facebook page not too long ago, and one of my readers had such a great answer, and I totally agree with her, and so I wanted to share that here. As we talked about, why don't you teach reading, right? This question that we often get when we use a play-based, developmentally appropriate approach to building foundational emergent literacy skills, that some people may walk into that classroom and say, why aren't you teaching reading, right? So here's her answer. She said, every time I read a story to the kids, I'm teaching reading. Every time I put my finger on words as I'm reading aloud, I'm teaching reading. Every time I ask kids what they think will happen next, I'm teaching reading. Every time I pause while reading and let the kids finish the sentence, I'm teaching reading. Every time we draw pictures of a story, I'm teaching reading. Every time we act out a story, I'm teaching reading. Every time I ask a child to find his or her printed name amongst those of his or her peers, I'm teaching reading. Every time we trace letters, lines, and shapes in the air, the sand, or elsewhere, I'm teaching reading. Every time we sing songs together, I'm teaching reading, and the list goes on. I just thought that was such a great response, and it's something that I think as early educators, we have a responsibility to teach other educators or administrators or parents to help them to recognize, this is why I do what I do. Let me help you to see how I'm building this foundation and why it's important. Because if we can't explain it, then who will, right? There's a lot of concern in early education about appropriate practice being taken out of the classroom. And I feel like because of that, it becomes that much more imperative for us as professionals and advocates to be able to communicate efficiently and effectively the importance of what we're doing and why we do it so that people will see it for what it is and value it for what it's truly worth. So let's go back to this question. So the first question is, why don't you teach reading? And that's why it's important for us to be able to communicate what we're doing and how it applies to building emergent literacy skills that support later reading skills as well. That answers the first side of the question. And the other side of the question, which is also well-intended, is, is it damaging to teach reading too soon? So again, we have to go back to that first definition. We're talking about early literacy skills, and that's what we do definitely want to have in our early childhood classrooms. Tons and tons of early literacy is going on and should be going on and is not damaging to kids. Now, what I see when people ask this type of question, what they're really asking about is some other practices that relate to reading that can be harmful or less effective or appropriate for young children. And here's what I see actually going on. So some of the real problems with approaches to literacy and reading would first of all be when they're teaching reading as a performance task instead of building foundational literacy skills. So if there is an emphasis on just getting kids to read as a performance or as what would be called a splinter skill, when I talked to the director of the �𝐞𝐞 Institute when they did their study, which I'll link in the show notes, showing that kids are still following a developmental progression that is similar to what has been known over decades and decades. They showed that kids are still following that same pattern, that they aren't developing at a faster rate, despite what we may sometimes think in popular culture. And so when I asked her, well, what about people who say, but these kids can do it, or those kids can do it, they're doing things that are or have been assumed to be a higher level skill. So for example, what about people who say, well, kindergartners can read at the level we thought second graders should read in the past? And what she said was that sometimes we can get them to do it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they know. And she referred to this as a splinter skill. So if you think of like a stick, right? And a splinter is the small thing that's broken off. So sometimes we can teach kids a task, a performance, and it's like just breaking off this little piece and putting all of our emphasis there, getting them to perform. But we missed the full stick. We missed the full accumulation of skills that kids really need. So that would be a problem if we have a program that is teaching reading, quote unquote, but they're actually just teaching one splinter skill to get them to appear to perform, to look like they're reading when we may be missing really critical skills. So one example of this, one extreme example would be the Teach Your Baby to Read program that was popular, I think it was a couple decades ago now. That's an example of teaching reading as a splinter skill, a performance task, when the actual connections, the actual learning was not there. It was not really benefiting kids in the way that it purported to do. The other place where we have real problems is not with building literacy, but when we teach reading as a high pressure, you're already behind type of an approach. This is where we see burnout. So we're not going to burn out kids by exposing them to great literature or finger plays and playing with sounds and with their names and with letters and words and exposing them to these rich, literate environments. That's not going to burn kids out. What burns them out is when they are in a high pressure environment or when they're already getting this message that they're behind, that they're not a good reader. I've heard of kids who have already been kind of labeled as behind in kindergarten because they haven't hit a certain benchmark of sight words. Now that could be dangerous for some kids to be given that message that you're behind, you're not a very good reader, when in reality they're very much within a developmental norm. The third area that we see a real problem is teaching reading at the expense of the whole child development. So this approach that communicates that what we need now, this performance we need now, is more important than the other things. So anytime we put an extreme emphasis on one skill, we're going to displace other skills. And so when this is done with reading in an effort to get ahead, we actually fall behind. So one example of this would be when we overemphasize skills such as reading to the extent that it displaces skills such as social and emotional development and growth, which we know is linked long-term to positive outcomes for kids. We don't have any academic data that supports the idea that kids who learn to read at 5 are better off than kids who learn to read at 6 or 7. It just doesn't exist empirically. We do, however, have data that tells us that kids who build strong social skills in kindergarten have more positive outcomes over decades of their lives. And so when we talk about data-based or study-based curricula or approaches to education, the data supports putting in these strong social and emotional factors in early childhood over reading. So that's not to say we don't have literacy skills in there. Those are also important, and there are indicators that show that it's important. But if we emphasize that to the extent that we're pushing out social skills, that we're pushing out experiences for play that will build those social skills, if we're emphasizing it to the point that we're pushing out other aspect of whole child development, then yes, it could be detrimental to our children. Building literacy skills in and of itself is not detrimental to kids, but overemphasizing it to the point that it displaces other important aspects of child development can be detrimental. So that's what we're really talking about when people are asking, is it detrimental to teach our kids reading, as they would say? I would say early literacy. The answer is no, as long as it's in the appropriate balance. So let's talk just really quickly here. This is a very brief overview, but as we talk about these emergent literacy skills that we should be emphasizing and building in the early childhood years, let's talk just briefly about what those skills look like. So again, emergent literacy, these are the skills that will build that foundation that will then support conventional reading and writing as the child continues to develop and grow. This is the process of becoming literate. We have to start with those foundational skills. So one area is alphabet knowledge, and this is often the first one that people will think of, that they need to teach their children the letters of the alphabet, right? And this is true. We do need young children to begin to recognize the letters of the alphabet, to recognize both the form and the function, that they carry sounds and that they can begin to build together to create words, and that then leads into other aspects of emergent literacy. Another area is phonological awareness, and that is a mouthful right there. And that encompasses a lot of other aspects. So phonemic awareness, which is the smallest unit of sound in a word. So being able to hear and manipulate those sounds is extremely important in early literacy skills. But it looks just as simple as playing with nursery rhymes and playing with funny, silly songs, anything that allows a child to hear and manipulate the sounds. So changing beginning and ending sounds, moving sounds around in a word. Oftentimes it just looks like being silly and playing, but it really is a critical part of building skills that will support later reading. Another area of emergent literacy is emergent writing. And again, sometimes when I talk to teachers about emergent writing, their first response is, well, I teach 2-year-olds or 3-year-olds. They don't write yet. And that's true if we're looking from a conventional sense, but the reality is that they begin to experiment and explore the concepts of writing at a very, very early age. It follows a developmental progression, and it's fascinating to look at these different progressions. I'll link down here to Heidi Song's chart of developmental progression of writing. It begins with pictures and scribbles and beginning to try to write something that looks like a letter but isn't a letter, and then stringing them together. And it just follows this great progression, which then tells us what they understand about writing and about literacy. That even if they just scribble on a page and hand it to you and tell you that it's a story or a letter, that tells me right there that they understand that a written symbol can carry meaning. And that's one of the most important things that a child can understand about writing, that it carries meaning, that it can they can write down a symbol and it's going to carry meaning, a message. That's a critical understanding. So in emergent writing, we can set up a writing center in our classrooms and invite children to make a mark on a page that says something or means something. That's the beginning of writing. So we want to give them lots of different supplies and let them experiment with that. We want to invite them to make a book, which I'm trying to remember where I read that difference. They said sometimes if you tell a child to write a book, they will tell you, I can't write. But if you invite them to make a book, it's less intimidating. They like to make it. It actually reminds me of when I was doing my kindergarten student teaching, and one of the girls brought me a note, and I opened it up to see all these squiggly marks all over the page. And I said, oh, thank you for this letter. What does it say? And she just looked at me and said, I don't know. I can't read. So when we recognize this process of emergent writing, this developmental process, we want to support our young children in recognizing that they are writers and readers, that they can make marks that carry meaning, that together as a class, you can create a book to, share pictures from an experience and get their words to put on a page to describe what they experienced, what was going on. There are lots of different ways to involve and engage kids in writing experiences. And while there's a lot of emphasis on handwriting, when we start to talk about writing, people often think about, again, alphabet knowledge, which we talked about, and the importance of writing and creating letters. That's important. That's true. But we have to extend our understanding beyond just the formation of letters as writing, that writing is the concept that I can put a mark on a page and it means something. It communicates something. If we take away that meaning, it's really not writing anymore. It's just printing, right? It's just handwriting. We want to emphasize writing as a skill that I can communicate a message to someone by creating symbols. Another area that may be easily overlooked is oral language, and it's actually a huge component in building literacy. That children build this back and forth process of having conversations, that they build their vocabulary and understanding of words is so critically important because literacy, again, starts with meaning. If we try to teach literacy without teaching meaning, we're just teaching a task. It really doesn't mean anything, and it won't hold any wealth for them. It won't hold any importance for them. If we focus on the fact that literacy starts with meaning, we have so much more buy-in and passion from our kids and from us as teachers as well. So we can do this. Two of the strongest ways that we can do this is with reading and with conversation. So having rich conversation, rich teacher talk, or talk in our home. There are tons of studies, really strong studies that support the importance of having conversations with kids, exposing them to lots of words and ideas, and conversing back and forth, that builds their vocabulary, and that then supports later learning, including reading skills. The other area is in reading books to them, because often the words that we use in our conversations are different than the words that are used in books. I love to just flip through a child's picture book and find some of the words in there that we don't often use in our day-to-day conversation, but kids don't even miss a beat with them. So words like dismayed, or frankly, or beaming. These are all words that we may not include in our day-to-day conversation, but are pretty easy to find in a book that you would read to a 4-year-old. And I love to turn to them and say, can you show me what your face would look like if you were beaming? And you can tell that they understand what that word means. So if we're talking about building oral language skills, we want to make sure we're engaging in conversation and that we're also having rich and dynamic reading experiences with them. It's important to build oral language skills because that's going to help them, again, to have meaning in their literacy experiences going forward. And that helps with a lot of skills, for example, with comprehension and decoding. So those are two important skills for reading. Comprehension means you understand what you're reading. You're not just decoding the words, but you understand and remember what's going on. So if you consider someone decoding a bunch of words in a story, if they're decoding words that they don't understand, it's going to be really hard to comprehend. It takes a lot of effort to decode, and it takes a lot of effort to decipher meaning if you're having to use contextual clues rather than actually understanding the words. So you're going to have kids who have an easier time comprehending if they have a larger vocabulary. It's also going to be easier for them to decode what words are in the first place if they know a lot of words. Because if you think of some of these big, huge words, it's really difficult for them to decode words that they've never heard before. So we start with that oral language. Building that up helps build literacy skills and reading skills in the future because, again, it all begins with meaning. And so if we build oral language skills and create an understanding and the meaning behind it all, it makes it a lot easier for them then to build skills later on down the road. One more area to consider with emergent literacy is concepts of print. So the understanding of how to hold a book, how to turn the pages, that the print goes from left to right across the page, that print represents words in and of itself. So when a child sees a sign and says, hey, that says Target, even though they may just be recognizing that as environmental print, they're just associating it rather than decoding letter by letter, that is still a part of emergent literacy because they're understanding the concept that this print consistently represents this word and that carries meaning. So we want to make sure we're emphasizing environmental print around them that they are recognizing and attributing meaning to. Even if they can't decode the letters, they're recognizing the importance and the meaning of those words. We can also do that with functional print. So when we label things or when we ask them to sign in their name on a sheet that shows that they attended today or a sign-up sheet that means they want to take a turn, anytime that we're allowing them to use print in a way that carries a function, that will help them to build their concepts of print. And then perhaps one of the easiest ways is just when we share read-alouds with them, that we point out things like the title or following our finger under the line, pointing where the words are, following that left to right and the return sweep with our fingers, that we're helping them to understand the concepts of print, how it is used, and how we can use it to convey meaning again. Don Holdaway said that literacy ought to be one of the most joyful undertakings ever in a young child's life. And I really believe that it can be when we approach it with the right attitude, that literacy is rich in play, it's rich in meaning, it's rich in connection. And that's something that kids and adults can really get passionate about and really excited about and truly enjoy as they build this foundational process. So I hope that what we've discussed today helps to frame the concept of early literacy in a more appropriate way for you, and maybe helps you to address those two tricky questions that we often get, whether it's why don't you teach reading, or isn't it dangerous to teach reading to preschoolers? I hope that you now have a deeper understanding about what's really going on when we talk about early literacy versus reading, and what young children really need in a literacy-rich environment. Because these foundational years really are critical and crucial and powerful. We don't want to avoid literacy experiences any more than we want to crowd out other aspects of development to push in what they don't need today. We want to give them joyful literacy experiences in these early childhood years. Thanks again for listening to Not Just Cute, the podcast. You can find show notes at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 13. I'm Amanda Morgan. You can read more on my blog and sign up for the Not Just Cute newsletter at notjustcute.com, and follow me on Facebook. That's facebook.com/notjustcute. Thanks for listening today, and thank you for standing up for children and for childhood.